Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Class 2, our second week of class here. So I have a lesson plan for Class 2 in our Pages section of Canvas, so I'm going to click on that. And this is actually a fairly brief lesson plan for the day. We're actually going to try a class exercise when we get together at noon today. So, keep that in mind. Hopefully you'll be able to use Teams and have Maya open at the same time so that we can work together on a class exercise. And that'll be a TBA, to be announced. So today what I want to do is I want to just cover some of the basics, the basic tools, or I should say the primary tools. They're not necessarily basic, but the primary tools that we use to build animation in Maya. And then I want to do, I call this a review. I'm assuming that this is done in the 3D animation class, but I'm not sure. But it's the bouncing ball. The bouncing ball is the fundamental. It's sort of like the perfect sketch for a character animator because there's so much at work. It's such a simple animation, but yet the foundations that are needed really are the foundations you need for character animation. So what we're actually going to do in there is we're gonna go into our first two principles of animation. We're going to take a look at squash and stretch and easing. So we'll get to those in a little bit. So I want to start with these basic concepts. So the first thing here is keyframing. So I'm just going to move this. Well, let me move that out of the way and let me bring up Maya. All right, I moved it out of the way so I have it as reference over here. It's like I can't remember the brief lesson plan we have. So keyframing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an animation here. So I'm going to go to the Create menu and just make a poly cube. And I'll zoom in on that a little bit. And I'm going to, I think I'm just going to rotate it. So I think there's a number of ways to set keyframes in Maya. We can set keyframes down here on the timeline using auto key, which is it gets squished out. I have to open my viewport up a little bit. Right there it is. That's your auto key button. I prefer not to use auto key. I will use auto key once I've laid down what I call the blocking pass, which is the primary poses that our animation's going to do. Those are sort of like snapshots in time of the primary movements or poses. And we'll get to those details down the road also. But after I lay down that blocking pass, then I might activate auto keying. But when I'm first keying, and especially if I'm creating or building an animation that's fairly basic, like a cube, then I don't use auto key. I like to work in the channel box here, and then I key right in the channel box right there. So I'm at frame 1 on my timeline. I'm also running at 24 frames per second. I might want to switch that. I can switch it right here. This is being cut off. I could switch it to 30. 30 is an even number for excuse me, working in game projects because we're usually running at 60 or 120 frames per second or something like that. Now, when I do that, you'll notice that my timeline here is sitting on a fraction of a frame at the beginning. It's at 1.25. So I'm going to want to make that a whole number. So what I can do is just this is the far number, or I should say this is the beginning of our timeline. This is what we see here in the timeline window or time slider window. And then this also is what we see on this end. And you can see it actually goes out to 250, which is beyond this marker. So these two inner numbers here represent what we can see on the time slider, and the outer two numbers represent the total frames in the animation. It's not really that big of a deal. You can change these anytime during the animation process. So I'm going to say that I want to start at 0, and I also want the time slider to be at 0. So you see it moves to 0 right there. And here I'm going to go, let's see, I'm going to do maybe a 60 frame animation. So I'll set the time slider to 60, but I'll also set my total animation frames to 60. That's what those numbers do, those type in numbers. Now I'm still sitting on 1 1/4 frame. Now as soon as I drag or scrub the playback head, we call this scrubbing the playback head when we just move it back and forth I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0. Or you can type that value in right here, and it will move the time indicator to that point in time. So at frame 0, I just want to rotate around the y-axis right here, the y-axis. Now the way I'm moving this by dragging it is, if you're not familiar with this in Maya, you can select a value or an attribute here. And then if I put my cursor in the viewport with that attribute active or selected, I can use my middle mouse button and drag left and right. It kind of acts like an interactive slider. That's a really handy feature. Okay, so at frame 0, I want my rotate Y to have a 0 value. So I'm going to right click on it and then choose key selected. You can also use the S key on the keyboard, which stands for set key. But then that's going to set keys on all of the keyable attributes. And I like to try to keep or limit what I'm setting keys on. If I'm not animating on translate X, Y, or Z, then I don't want to set keys on it. So by manually doing this over here in the channel box, by right-clicking on the value and choosing key selected, you'll see that turns red. So there's only a key on rotate Y, none of the others. So watch what happens if I hit S, the S key for set key on the keyboard. It keyed everything, including visibility. I don't want to turn it on and off, so why set keys on that? Now, if you set keys and you want to get rid of them, the best way to do that is to right-click on that attribute and choose break connections, and see how that got rid of all of the animation on Translate X. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select all of these. Just click drag, right click, and choose break connections. So now I've gotten rid of all the animation. But now I need to go back and set the key for my rotate Y, so I'll do that. Key selected. Then I'm going to go out to frame 60, and I'm just going to type the value in here. I want it to rotate a full 360 degrees. So I'll type in 360, and then I need to set the key again. Notice it's a pale red. That means that you've changed the value, but you haven't set a key yet. Now, just another visual indicator that we have in Maya. So I'll right click on it again and key selected. So now I have an animation. You'll notice in the time slider, I have what's called a tick mark. I have a tick mark at 0 and a tick mark at 60. And now if I scrub the playback head, we can see the animation playing. Now, a couple other things to be aware of. We can manipulate the timing of these keys, meaning, we can add frames or remove frames between the two keyframes. If we remove frames, we're going to make the animation faster. If we add frames, we're going to make it slower. So what I'm going to do, the way I can do that is I hold down the Shift key and click on a frame, in this case frame 60. And now if I middle mouse drag, I can pull that keyframe somewhere else. So that's a really straightforward way of manipulating your keys or key ticks right on the timeline. And sometimes I do that, but I have to say this is what's going to get us into the next two components on our lesson plan, the graph editor and the dope sheet. That's really where we do most of our retiming work. Excuse me, I'm getting a drink of coffee here because I'm going to go hoarse trying to do this lecture. So let me open up the graph editor. So once I've created an animation, the graph editor is where we can do some retiming. Basically what the graph editor does is it allows us to control the timing between the keyframes. So you'll notice if I press play on this, notice it's very subtle, but notice how it slowly picks up speed, then it slows down at the end. It's not a constant speed from 0 to 60. And that's actually the principle of easing. It's easing in from 0 and easing out to 60. And as the name suggests, it means we're easing into it. We're starting slow, then picking up speed, and then we ease out. We come in fast, then we slow down as we approach frame 60. So that in-between keyframes speed is controlled with the graph editor. So with the object selected, I'm going to come up here to the Windows menu, and I'm going to go to Animation Editors because we're in animation, we're animating. And right there it is, the graph editor. So I'll open that up. This is going to get really crunched here in my recording window, but you'll see there's the graph. So right there is rotate Y. That's the only animated attribute. So that's the only one listed in here. And basically what we have is we have the time from left to right. So there's frame 0, there's frame 60. And then going from up the graph is the value. So you can see this is rotate Y is 0 right here. And it'll even tell us that up here. It'll tell us the value and the frame number. This is value, this is frame number. So actually I can move this. If I wanted to start on frame 1, I could change this value to 1. Oops, I think I might have done that backwards. Let me see. Let me try here. 1. There we go. I'm sorry. Scratch that. The first type in value is the frame number. The second one is the value. Frame number, value. So if I make that 10, see how that keyframe jumped to frame 10. I'll go ahead and set that back to 0. Or if I wanted to change the value, I could. I can make this 180, and now you'll notice that it jumped up to 180. Again, I'll set it back to 0. So there's our keyframes, here and here. Now, now you're seeing how quickly the value changes. So here's where we're getting that easing. It's easing in, so it's starting slow. We see it's sort of hovering around 0 for a few frames. Then it starts to change quickly. And then it gets up here and hovers around 360 for a few frames until it comes to a stop. So this is the best place to control the first principle we're covering, easing, in the graph editor. So what we can do is we can further control that easing by working with the tangent handles. So you'll see there's a tangent handle right here, and I can move that around. Now, it doesn't allow me to make the handle longer, which would allow me to increase the easing. So in order to do that, what we need to do is we have to free the tangent weights. This is kind of a screwy procedure in Maya, but this is how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and select both keyframes because I want to do this to both. So I just did a rectangular selection here. And I'm going to come up here to tangents. And this is actually a two-step process. I have to, or maybe, no, I might only be one step now. It used to be two-step. We just need to choose free tangent length. Oh, no, I have to do, first of all, I have to go to, yeah, so first of all, I have to go to the curve menu. Sorry, I forgot that. So I go to the curves menu and I have to make the tangents weighted. That's step 1. Then with the keyframe still selected, then I go to tangents and do free tangent length. Now I can take these tangent handles and move them around. So if I really exaggerate the ease in and ease out on this, let's see what that does. I'm just going to move this out of the way for a second. And I'll play it. See how it's really slow at the beginning and then really slow at the end. All right, so some other interesting things we can do with this is I can actually, now this is giving us a preview of some of our other principles of animation. If I push the beginning curve down a little bit this way and the end curve up this way, what we're actually going to do is it's going to go backwards in the opposite direction, then forward. And it's going to basically overshoot 360 and then come back to rest at 360. So what I did here is I very quickly created some anticipation. This would be anticipating the animation. And then this would be what we call follow through. Those are two other principles of animation. And we'll cover those in more detail, but the easing and anticipation and follow through are two really easy ones to address when we're learning how to use the graph editor. So let's see what this does. So I'll move this out of the way now and play it. See how I get a little bit of, actually it's tough to see because the animation is looping back on itself so quickly. So sometimes what I like to do is add a little bit of what I call frame padding. So my animation stops at 60, but I'm going to make it, I'm going to set it to, oh my gosh, it's again, 90. So now I have 90 frames in my animation. That's going to allow it to sit in a rest position for at least 1 second before it loops back on itself. Sometimes that helps us to be able to read the animation a little better. I call that frame padding. So now if I play it, see how we have that little bit of anticipation and follow through. Anticipation, follow through. All right, so you can see how useful the graph editor can be because it allows us to control timing between keyframes. So a lot of power in there. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, I guess I can leave them that way. Sure, why not? Okay, so that's a quick rundown of the graph editor. And the other one that we use is the dope sheet. Now you may or may not have used the dope sheet before. The dope sheet doesn't really come into play unless you're trying to manipulate a lot of keyframes simultaneously. And if we're doing simple animations like this, it's not really necessary. But when we're working with a character that might have 100 controls and each control has rotate and translate values, those keyframes start to add up. So again, I'm going to go to Windows. I have my object selected. I'll go to Windows, Animation Editors. Where's the dope sheet? Right there. So here's my dope sheet. Now basically the dope sheet just shows us the keyframes. It doesn't show us the graph. And so here's my cube. And if I pop that open, we can see under rotate, there's my rotate Y value. So what I can do in here is just move these keys around. Now, if we have a lot of different animated attributes, I could choose specific attributes to animate or to retime, or I can, up here in the dope sheet summary, I'm going to do a rectangular selection here. That will select all of the animated attributes. Now I only have one, so we're not really seeing that difference here. But if I had another one, like rotate X, I could just select the rotate X keys and retime those. So really easy to do. The way it works in here is you select it with the left mouse button, and then with the middle mouse button, you can move the keys around. So if I wanted to slow this down even more, I could push this out to frame 90. And now my animation goes all the way out to frame 90. Oh, did I not put that on 90? I put it on 89. So we also have the type in values here too. So I can say 90 and they shift over to frame 90. All right, so now I have a much slower animation. Which actually, since I've added 30 frames to it, what that will allow me to do is maybe go back to the graph editor, and now I have more room to play with this, the overshoot here and the anticipation. Like that. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, let me again, see, it gets really confusing if I don't add the frame padding. So let me go out to frame 120 just to give us a little bit of rest at the end here. Oh, that looks a little odd. I guess I pushed the values too far in the graph editor is what's going on there. Let me bring my graph editor back up. And now also in, excuse me, in the graph editor, we can hit the F key. So I've selected the value. I can hit the F key to frame it. I can also use the Alt and right mouse button to zoom in and zoom out. So we can do that also. So yeah, I think I pushed that too far. I think I wanted to go this way more, but I didn't want to add more to the value. I want to keep the value low, but just have a longer anticipation and a longer, I didn't get that one, longer follow through. I'm basically smoothing that a little bit. Now let's see how it looks. I'll rewind and play. There we go. That's better. So that's the dope sheet. The dope sheet is pretty simple to understand. We can also scale in here, so we could select a whole bunch of keys like this, and then I can I can just select my scale tool, or we can those are all our selection tools. Yeah, so I could use the R key on the keyboard. Just like in Maya, R is the scale tool. If I hit R in here, this is going to allow me, again, I'm doing a middle mouse button. Actually, with this tool, with the scale tool, you can use the left mouse button or the middle mouse button, and I can just scale all the keys. So that's with the R. And then if I hit W, I just go back to the regular select and move tool. And with the move tool, you have to use the middle mouse button. Maya just is like it can't make up its mind. Middle mouse button, left mouse button. If you're ever in here and you use your left mouse button, it doesn't move, then that means use your middle mouse button. So it's either one, I was going to say one or the other or both. It's actually one or both. If you're using scale, it can be either. If you're just moving the keys, then it's only the left mouse button. All right, so that's a quick rundown of our dope sheet here. And the last ones that I wanted to take a look at are the tracks editor and time editor. So the time editor and tracks editor, these are our non-linear editing tools. So again, from the animation editors, they're right here. Now the tracks editor is the old version of the non-linear editing system. So I'm not even going to cover that one. The time editor is a new one. The tracks editor will probably go away someday. But what this will allow us to do is this allows us to take either segments of our animation or all of the animation, package it into a clip, and then we can retime that clip in the time editor as if we're working in a non-linear editor, like a video editor, like Premiere. So we have these clips and we can mix and match them on top of each other and mix them together and retime them. I'm just going to do a quick overview of it here today because we're going to get into it in more detail later in the semester. But this is another very important animation tool. Actually, not only in Maya, I do have to mention that every 3D application has all these tools. They have a graph editor, they have a dope sheet, and they have some sort of nonlinear editor. So these are just what they're called in Maya. So I'll open up the time editor. So here it is here. Now I don't have anything in the time editor yet, so it has these nice big 3 buttons here, and it says import content from external file. That's not what I want to do. Or add selected content from the scene. So I do have my cube selected. So I'll hit this button. And what it has done is it has created a clip here, an animation clip. And if I move this out of the way, notice on the timeline, my key ticks are gone. They're not there anymore. And the red indicator over here saying that rotate Y had keys on it is now yellow, which is telling us that it's actually being controlled by a clip. So here's my clip. Now, by default, if I run, let me do it this way. I'm going to put this right at the bottom here so we can see both. So if I play my playback head, I still have the same animation, but now it's contained in a clip, which is easily manipulated. So right now the animation starts right at frame 0. But watch what happens if I take that clip and I just move it down the timeline. Now there's no animation until it hits that clip. Then the animation starts. So you can see how this can be really useful for retiming very complex animations. Or reordering them, but I can also retime them. So I just grab this end here. I am making it, well, I was at frame 90. If I put it at frame 45, I've now just made the animation twice as fast. So if I press play, oops, actually, you know what I did? I think I clipped it. I didn't actually retime it. We have our different tools are right here. I was in trim mode, so I trimmed the animation. That's the default mode, is trim. Let me go ahead and set that back to frame 90. And I should have my whole animation. Make sure it's back. It is. Okay. So now I need to choose the scale tool right here. So I choose scale, Now if I drag it back to frame 45, I should get a faster animation. There we go. See, it completes the entire animation in 45 frames. So this is a really, really great tool. So I wanted to point that one out also. And we'll work with this one in more detail later on in the semester. But that's our nonlinear editor. It's called the time editor. Okay, so that takes me through just the quick introduction to our basic animation tools that we'll be using in Maya. And now I want to just go over my process for how I would create a bouncing ball. So I'm going to reset Maya here. And I'll set my frame rate to 30 frames per second. And then I'm going to create a poly sphere. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a little bit of rigging, because the other principle of animation that I'm going to introduce you to today is squash and stretch. So what squash and stretch does is that it's telling us that our object will stretch in the direction that it's moving, and it will squash, obviously, when it hits the ground. But it needs to maintain its volume. So I could try to do squash and stretch with, by animating scale. But we can see when I just pull it this way, I'm actually adding volume to it. Because if I pull it, if I stretch it in this direction, that means that it needs to squeeze in this direction to maintain its volume. So trying to animate with scale to do squash and stretch is probably not the best way to work. We actually have a deformer that does this for us. And we can find the deformers in the modeling menu set, or we can find it in the rigging menu set. I'll go to animation. Since we're animating, we might as well stay in the animation menu set. Where are they? Right here under deform. So I have my object selected. I'm going to go to deform. And this is considered a non-linear deformer. So I have to go to the non-linear category. And I'm going to choose squash. So I just added the squash deformer to my sphere. So if I come over here to the channel box, down under inputs, there's my squash deformer right there. If I click on it, it will then show me the attributes for the squash deformer. And the factor is the one we want. So if I go, actually, let me do it this way. If I go in the positive direction, it stretches. And notice how it maintains its volume. It's so much more organic than trying to do the scale tool. And then if I go in the negative values, it squashes. So already I can see how this is going to work for a cartoony-like bouncing ball. All right, so I'm going to set that factor value back to 0. Now, one thing we have to be careful of in Maya, though, is the deformer is not parented by default to the object that's deforming. Notice how I can move the object, but it leaves the deformer behind. And that's not good, because it's going to, since it deforms in local space, when we move it out of that local space, we're going to get weird deformations. So basically what we need to do is parent the deformer to the object so that when we move the object, the deformer goes with it. What we're actually doing right now is we're doing the rigging process. This is a simple rig, but what we're doing is we're adding a squash deformer, we're parenting it to the object so that the animation process is easier. That's the definition of rigging. So the way I like to do this in the channel, or not the channel box, what am I saying? The outliner. So there's my squash deformer, there's my sphere. What I'm going to do is I'm going to middle mouse drag the squash deformer onto the sphere. I'm middle mouse dragging. And so now it is parented to the sphere. All right, I'll move that out of the way. And now when I move the sphere, notice the squash deformer goes with it. So that's what we need. All right, so now I'm ready to start blocking out this animation. I'm actually going to do this. I think I'm going to switch to one of my orthographic views. I'll go to no, I don't want to go to the side. I want it to actually move, go back to perspective here. I want it to move on the x-axis right there, which is the red axis. So let's see, what orthographic view do I want? Side has x pointing towards us, so that's not what I want. So I actually want probably front. There we go. So I want it to go in this direction. So I'm doing this in the front viewport. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Let me set my timeline up here. I'm at 30 frames per second. I'm going to do a ball bounce over, let's see, I'm going to just kind of time this out in my head. 1, 2, maybe 2 seconds. So let's make that 60 frames. And I want to start it at 0. All right. So let's assume that this is the ground right here. This is the origin, the Y origin. So what I want to do is I'm going to lift it up in the air. I want the ball to start bouncing from up in the air. So I'll lift it up in the air like this. And I'm going to be animating it on Y, that's the up and down movement, and also on X, which is the forward movement. So that means that I'm going to have to key both translate X and Y. So I'm going to select both of these. I'm on frame 0, and I'll right click and key selected. Then I'll move down the timeline. I guess I'll do this in about half-second increments. So I'm going to come down to frame 15. I'll grab the ball. And I need to get, here we go. And I'm just going to move it forward and down where it bounces off the ground. I'm not too concerned with where it is because I'm going to finesse the curve bounce in a little bit using a couple tools in here, including the graph editor. So I just moved it forward, and now I need to set these keys again. So I'll key selected. Let me zoom out a little more on this here. Then I'm going to go to frame 30, and I'll move it forward a little more and up, but not as high as where it started because it'll lose height or velocity as it bounces. So I'll key those. Then I'll go to frame 45. I'll move it forward again and down to where it bounces off the ground. And I'll key that. And then I'll go out to frame 60, move it forward a little more and up, and then key it again. And this is probably not going to look very good. This is, I just was guessing at that. So let's see what we have. We have a lot of problems here. Actually, the spacing, the distance spacing is not so bad. But we can visualize that. A really great tool in any 3D application is to visualize the path that your object is taking. And we do that from the Visualize menu. So I have my object selected. I'm going to go to Visualize, and I'm going to choose. This is relatively new in Maya, so it confuses me. It's called an editable motion trail. Now I can open up the options for this. Let's see what the options are, just to make sure we have everything we need. We're going to have it visualize the entire time slider, 1 frame increments. And it's going to draw the trail thickness. Yeah, this looks good. I don't need to change any of the default values here. So I'll hit Create Motion Trail. And now it's showing me the spacing there. So actually, that's not too bad. I guess of many years of creating bouncing balls, I can kind of eyeball it. But if we want, we can move these a little bit. Like this, if this way, the worst thing you can do when you're creating a bouncing ball is have, a graph that looks like this or a trail that looks like that. This needs to be evenly spaced. So I'll do that. We also don't want these to be really high in the air like that. So this one's a little lower than the start, and then this one is a little lower than that second bounce. So spacing wise, that looks pretty good. Now, the problem I have, the real problem here is we should have a little bit of an arc there, and this needs to be angular. So what's happening here is it's easing. It's easing into this key and out of this key. And we don't want that. We want it to maybe ease in here, but we don't want it to ease here. It needs to come into this keyframe at full speed and exit the keyframe at full speed. Same thing here. Come in at full speed, exit at full speed. And the way we handle that is in the graph editor. So I'll grab my object, my sphere, then I'll open up my graph editor. This brings up another really important issue. So we have two values in here. So translate x is it moving, that's just it moving forward. It's moving forward in this direction. That's the x value. Now it has keys there. These keys are not really doing anything. So what I like to do, I call this cleaning the graph. You want to do this all the time. These keys, although they don't really look like they're influencing the animation much, they actually are. You'll get some weird pops and hesitations in your animation if you leave keys like this on the timeline. They are changing that X value just enough that we get weird movements or pauses. So if you have keys that are not doing anything definitive, remove them like that. Now it's also easing in and easing out. I don't want the forward movement to ease at all. I've told it where to be in space, so I don't need it to slowly start in and slowly start out. So I'm actually going to take these and just move them so that I have a linear animation like this. Or I could come up here and use some presets. This little preset here is linear. That's linear and linear. I got pretty close by eyeballing it with the tangent handles, but you can use that if you want. Now let's see what that did. Already you can see that that gives us a little bit of an arc into the animation and out of the animation, but it doesn't address these bounces here. So we're going to take care of that. Oh, I just docked that accidentally, which I don't want to do, or I didn't want to do. Oh my gosh, how do I undock this now? Oh wait, that's my, oh, there's a graph editor. I was looking at the wrong thing, okay. So let me bring the graph editor up. I don't want to dock it though. I like them free floating. So now we need to focus on translate Y. This looks like the path our bouncing ball should take. And this is not what it should look like when it hits, when it hits the ground right there. So what I need to do is I need to break these tangents so that I can make them linear. I mean, I could make it linear here, but it's not going to quite get them where they need to be. So, gosh, why does Maya do that? They change stuff, and you know, I'm doing a drag like that, and then it pops in my translate X. That is really weird. Sometimes I think they do with Maya what Adobe does with Photoshop. You know, they add new tools that just make it worse instead of better. So, okay, so, oh my gosh, did it again. I just want to look at my translate Y. All right, so I have that keyframe. Oh my gosh. All right, well, we'll just work it this way. I have that keyframe selected, and now I'm going to go to tangents, and this time I'm going to choose break tangents. You know, when we wanted access to lengthening our tangent handles, we had to do curves, weighted tangents, then tangents, free tangent length. In this case, I want the tangents to work independent of each other. So I can select the key, and see, they actually work in unison, so I need to break those tangents. So in order to break the tangents, we have to select the key. Then I come up to tangents and I choose break tangents. So now you'll see that these tangents operate independent of each other. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to get a nice angle there. I'm lining the tangent handle up with the curve itself. And I'll do that to this one also. Tangents, break tangents. And then line them up like this. And I want to just look at, I have to just look at translate Y because I want to, why does it do that? That is some new weird feature. Yeah, I can move it, but as soon as I let go of my mouse, it shows me all the curves again. That is really annoying. Maybe there is a preference somewhere that will get rid of that for us. But now that's looking pretty good. So if I move it out of the way, we can see that my animation path or visualization path looks appropriate. So now if I play it, now that's way better, way better. So this is our first pass at the bouncing ball. You'll notice I did not worry about squash and stretch at all yet. So, when you're building your animations, you kind of do it in layers. So with the bouncing ball, the first layer is to get the spacing in the environment, and then the proper interpolation. That's actually what's going on in the graph here. This is interpolating between keyframes. Get the proper interpolation in the graph. Now I can focus on getting the proper squash and stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and close my graph editor for now and stop it. So now I'll come back to the beginning, or frame 0, and I'm going to zoom in on my sphere here in frame 0. So now I want to think about what's happening with the squash deformer. So if I give it a little bit of a stretch value, maybe 1, it's not stretching in the right direction. It needs to stretch in the direction that it's moving. So it actually needs to stretch that way. So my next pass that I'm going to do is actually just an adjustment pass to make sure that the sphere with its squash deformer is oriented properly. Now I'm going to keep the squash factor at 1 just so we can see more easily what I'm doing here. All right, so I want to line it up in the direction that it's moving. So basically what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be keying my rotate Z. You'll see that's the value that controls the orientation here. So I'll line it up this way. Again, the visualization path becomes really important here. So I line it up. Now I'm going to key my rotate Z. So I'll key it there. All right, and then when it gets down here to where it bounces off the ground, notice it's just kind of floating right now. So when it bounces off the ground here, I need to do a few things. It needs to stretch as it approaches the ground, but then right when it hits the ground, it needs to squash. And we know that it actually squashes in this direction. There's its squash. So that means that in frame 15, this actually needs to be rotated this way so that the squash is lined up right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and set a key on that. So again, rotate Z, key selected. Now let's see what that gives me. So if I go back, we see it, actually, I kept it squashed and not stretched. So we can see it goes from, that's how it should stretch, then it squashes. I'm trying to think what the easiest way to describe this. Whether I should actually animate the squash and stretch right here, just so we understand what's going on. Maybe I will. Okay, so I'm going back to frame 0, and I'm going to go to my squash input, and I want that to be, let's say, 0.5. So it's stretched out a little bit. And now I'm going to key that. I'm going to key the factor value. Then when I get to frame 15, I want it to be minus 0.5 so that it squashes there, and I'll key that again. Now let's see what happens. Okay, it's doing what it should, but it's anticipating the squash, which doesn't look right. We need it to stay stretched right up to the point where it hits the ground. So actually, I'm going to go 1 frame before 15. So I'm on frame 14, and I want it to stay stretched. So I'm going to set that to 0.5 and key it. What we sometimes refer to this as is a forced key. It's forcing an attribute to remain the same over a period of time instead of slowly changing. So now it stays stretched. That's good. And then it squashes. So I'm on the right track, but you'll notice that it kind of disoriented itself along the path here. So this is a point where I'm going to add what we call an in-between frame to kind of force it to where it should be. So in frame 14, let's zoom in on that so we can see it a little better. In frame 14, it should stay pointed in the direction it's moving like that. So in frame 14, I'm going to set a key for rotate Z. We could consider that a forced key too. We're forcing it to stay in a certain position. Now let's see if that took care of the orientation. Well, now it gets a little lazy up in here. So again, I'm going to set another in-between key, maybe right between these keys. Be very careful that you don't set keys one frame after the other. Now I did that here because there is some extreme changes in the motion. But if it's not an extreme change and you're just trying to make some minor adjustments, you want to try and set it midway between the previous key and the next key so that everything stays nice and smooth and we don't get any pops in the animation. So at frame 7, I'm going to just line that back up with the path and set another key for rotate Z. And now we see that takes care of it. So it looks pretty good right there. We see how it goes boink and it stretches. Stretches, then squashes. And I might even at frame 0 not want it to be stretched at all. So at frame 0, I might take my factor value here, make it 0, and rekey it. So now it's going to go from 0 and stretch out. See, now it's nice and organic. Okay, so that's the process. And basically, we're going to just keep doing that same thing down through each bounce. But I'm going to do this in a little more efficient way. I know what directions this needs to be oriented as it's bouncing now. So I'm not going to animate the squash and stretch as I move down the timeline. I'm going to go through and animate the rotation, then come back and do the squash and stretch. So at frame 15, it's squashed. At frame 16, it needs to be oriented this way because that's the direction it's going to stretch. So I'll set a key at 16. This is for my rotate Z value. Then it's going to come up over the top here. And over the top, it still needs to be going in the direction it's stretching, which is this way. Right now it's still squashed, so the opposite direction here. And I'll set a rotate Z key there. And again, I'm going to get a little bit of that laziness in here. See how it's not quite oriented right? So I'll just give it a little nudge and set another rotate Z key. And that looks pretty good now. So again, I'm just going to continue that process. So as it approaches frame 45, it should be rotating this direction so that it squashes. Be careful that you don't rotate it backwards. That's not going to look right. If you think about it, like if you throw a basketball, you bounce a basketball, if you watch it in slow motion, it's going to bounce forward, not bounce backwards, rotationally. So we're here. So we're coming forward to here. This is the bounce. So it needs to roll forward this way, like that. And I'll set that key. I'll go back one frame and force it into its stretched position and key it. All right, so again, we get some laziness there. A nice indicator you can see when I'm dragging the playback head is you can see the little stretch arrows there, or stretch markers. So right here, I'm going to force its orientation onto the path and key it again. So now see how you can see those little tick marks right there. I don't know if we'll call them tick marks. What do you want to call those? The little stretch handles. All right, so it's staying locked on the path. That's good. Then it rolls forward. Then it's going to bounce out of it in this direction, rolling forward this way. And key the rotate Z. And then I come up over the top right here, and I just need to orient it on the path again. And I probably have some laziness right there. You can see it, it is. And I'll straighten that out and key it again. And now I'm ready to go back and actually add the remainder of the animation for the the squash and stretch. So it squashes. Frame 16, it should stretch right back out. So I'll set my factor to 0.5, positive value, and key it. Oops, and these are some problems. Oh, there we go. So when I changed it here, it didn't update. That's just another bug in Maya, but you can see how that's nice and organic. So over the top. I could maybe reel back the stretch a little bit if I want, but it's maintaining the same velocity, so I don't necessarily need to get rid of any stretch there. And then we're going to hit the ground. So it's stretched. I actually want to set a key here for the stretch value because I didn't set one there. So I'm setting that so it stays stretched. Then it hits the ground. That's where it's going to be minus 0.5, so it squashes. I'll set a key on that. Then I'll go to the next frame and set it to 0.5 and key it. So now we have a nice bounce in here. And then finally, it comes back over the top. And again, I don't need to change the squash value. So let's look at this in the perspective view. Let's see how that's looking. And I'll play it. Not bad, but I think that actually the squash and stretch on the bounce, yeah, the squash and the bounce happens too quickly. You know, I think it's better visualizing it in the front view anyway. So again, let's look at it right here. See, it's super fast. So what I want to do, if I want to make it feel a little more organic, I could pull the squash and stretch keys out a little bit. Now I have to be careful though, because on frame 14 and 16, I have not only the squash factor key, but I also have a rotate Z key. So how can I filter which one I want to move? Because if I do a shift click on this now, I'm going to move both of them. So there's a couple ways we can do this. If you want to work in the time slider, we can filter our keys. If I right click on the time slider, oh, this is being cut off, but down towards the bottom is an option that says, or a category that says display key ticks, and it's set to active. Actually, I'm going to tear the menu off so you can see it. It's right here. So I can change it to from channel box. That means that it's only going to show me the keys of whatever I have selected in the channel box. So if I select expand, which hasn't been keyed, notice I don't see any keys in the timeline. But if I select the factor attribute, I see its keys and only its keys. So now I can take shift click on the key in frame 14, slide it back 1 to 13, then shift click on the key in 16 and slide it forward to 17. So that's one way of doing it. So if you want to filter your keys on the timeline, you have to right click, go to the display key ticks category and say from channel box, and then you'll have to come in here and select what attribute you want to filter to. Now, when you're done doing that, I would suggest setting this back to active so that you see all of your keys. Now, the other way to do this is by using the dope sheet. So with my object selected, I can go to my Windows animation editors, open up my dope sheet, and you can see here's my keys. So there's the second bounce out here. So I'm going to take my squash, there's my squash deformer right there. If I open it up, it will tell me there's its factor value. I actually don't need to break it down that far. I can just work right here. So what I can do is take each of these keys and middle mouse drag them back 1, middle mouse drag forward 1. Oops, there we go. Ah, that's not what I want to do. There we go. So what I did here in the dope sheet is gives me exactly the same results I did by filtering my keys in the time slider. So now let's have a look at that. So that one frame offset completely changes. It just gives the squash and stretch a little more room to breathe here, and it looks a lot better. Now, I could push this too far. I'm going to go back to my dope sheet. So what happens if I take these and push them maybe 2 frames over? 2 more frames. 2 more and 2 more. Let's see what that looks like now. I think I pushed it too far that now it's anticipating the squash too much. We can see that there in those few frames as it approaches the bounce. So, I recommend doing that though. You sometimes you want to push your animations too far, then back them off a bit. Because if you don't push them too far, you might not go far enough. So it's like this balance between it. So, and that's sort of the rule of thumb with animation. Push your animation farther than it should go, then reel it back in a little bit. So now I actually did move it 2 frames instead of 1, whereas before I had it 3. Let's see what that looks like. I think that looks pretty good. Now, if we stopped and look at it frame by frame, we'll see the anticipation. However, our audience may not notice that. And so having a 2 frame lead out on that for breathing room on the bounce, I think works pretty well. So that's always my warm-up example that we do in the character animation class before we actually get into full character rigs. So just to bring the lesson plan back up here, yeah, that's everything I wanted to cover. So this ended up being almost a 1-hour lecture just on something this simple. So, you want to watch this. And then we'll do a class exercise when we get together at 12 o'clock today. And we don't have any assignment for next week. I think we're going to just leave it at that for now. So I will see everybody at noon today in Teams.